This video is the first of two videos that describe how to use Microsoft Query, a software program packaged with Microsoft Office for importing external data into Excel. The Query program has been around for years, and many users consider it the best way to import external data into Excel. That might well change with the introduction of the Power Pivot add-in for Excel 2013, but Query is still worth knowing about. You can access it from the From Other Sources drop-down list on the Data ribbon. If this item isn't on your list, the program wasn't installed when Office was installed, so you will need to reinstall Office and make sure you check the Microsoft Query item. Using Query is a three-step process. First, you specify a data source, which is the subject of this video. Second, you define a query on the data source. And third, you return the resulting data to Excel. These last two steps are covered in the next video. To specify a data source, you need to specify the type of data source, which could be an Access database, a SQL Server database, or many other possibilities. You also have to specify the location of the source and possibly other information, including a username and password. Query uses a standard called ODBC, or Open Database Connectivity, developed in the early 1990s, to connect with the data source by using data source drivers, sometimes called providers. These are similar to printer drivers. For example, the driver for Access is a software tool for conversing with Access. The driver for SQL Server converses with SQL Server, and so on. These drivers allow one software program, Query, to connect with a variety of data sources. To illustrate, I will now define a new data source, a connection to the Access Northwind database stored on my desktop. From the Choose Data Source dialog box, I will choose the new data source item and click OK. Keep in mind, however, that if I had already done this in a previous session, the Northwind source would show up in this list, and I wouldn't need to define it again. Also, note the option at the bottom. You might want to use the Query Wizard, and you might not. I will explain these options in the next video. Clicking OK opens the Create New Data Source dialog box. I will first give the source a descriptive name. Second, I will select the driver for Access from the list you see here. Because my Access file has an MDB, not the newer ACCDB extension, I can choose either of two Access drivers. Next, I will click the Connect button to open a third dialog box. This provides a lot of possibilities, but because the Access database is on my hard drive and doesn't require a username or password, all I have to do is click Select and browse for my Northwind file. Now I can back out by clicking OK a couple times. There are other options, such as selecting a default table, but I will ignore them. When I get back to the Choose Data Source dialog box, my new Northwind Access source is in the list. If I close this and reopen it, the source will still be in the list. The information about this data source is actually stored in a small text file in an obscure location on my hard drive. If I click Delete, I see the name and location of this file. Here is what it looks like in Notepad. The procedure I just described changes depending on the type of data source. For example, suppose there is a Northwind database on a SQL Server system. I will try the same steps as before, specifying a SQL Server driver. When I click Connect, a very different dialog box opens. Because SQL Server is a server-based system, I have to provide the server name and my login information. In this case, my server name is all-in-one. And I'm using Windows authentication, so I check the Trusted Connection option. I will click Options and choose the Northwind database. Then I will back out as before. As you can see, I now have a second Northwind source. There are two other options I will mention briefly. First, if you select the Queries tab in the Choose Data Source dialog box, you can choose from any saved queries you created in a previous session with Microsoft Query. I don't have any yet. Second, the Olap Cube tab allows you to base the data source on a SQL Server Analysis Services cube, if you have a connection to such a server or an offline Olap Cube file, which I happen to have on my hard drive. In this case, I can return the results immediately to Excel as a pivot table. In summary, this video has gotten you to the point where you have defined at least one data source. The next step, discussed in the next video, is to click OK and define a query on the data source.